Okay. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first online meetup, which we are doing with our meetup groups, BlrDroid and BlrKotlin. I hope work from home is going good for everyone. Lockdown is treating you well. So, just a basic level of introduction, I guess everybody knows about BlrDroid. And since this is an online meetup, we would expect some, like, there is always a possibility of some problems occurring. So, please bear with us for now. We have multiple sessions lined up for you, and just quick comments on how to ask questions. So basically, speakers will be available here, and they will present their slides. You can ask the questions in the YouTube comments itself, and we'll highlight them over the stream. So there will be a limit of 5 questions per session, but each of the speakers will share their social contact. So basically, you can contact them later if you have any counter questions or questions later on. So yeah, we cannot really interact, so not much to say. So I have with me Rivu and Brijesh. Rivu from BlrKotlin and Brijesh is from BlrDroid. So yeah, so do you guys want to say something? That
Hi everyone, welcome to the today's event. Hope everybody is fully awake now. Yeah, that's all.
Good morning, everyone. Hope lockdown is treating you well and you all are healthy and safe. We will try to meet more on online event. Let's see how it goes today. Okay, we can start with the first speaker.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll start with sessions now. So let me just introduce Dinesh in the stream. Okay. Yeah. So Dinesh is Android engineer. He works in Gojek, and today his session is about Git commit messages and how you can use them to leverage good programming. So I'll now transfer this over to Dinesh. Let me just remove my screen. Yeah. Okay. So Dinesh, can you start sharing your screen?
Done. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, 1 second. Okay, so your screen is now visible. Okay, so yeah, we'll remove ourselves from stream, and Dinesh, you can start off in like 5 seconds.
Okay, so my presentation is visible, right?
Yeah, your presentation is visible. You can start now.
Awesome. Good morning, guys. Thank you for joining us today over here. And I hope quarantine is treating you well. Without any further delay, let's jump right into how to write better commit messages. I'll share my experience about writing commit messages and how we can leverage that for good software engineering. Right. So, yeah. So first of all, you need to think about Git commit messages as a mode of communication. Git commit messages are there to relay information from one developer to another developer. So it is not just any commit message; it's a mode of communication, right? So to write better communication messages, better Git commit messages, you need to have a shift in your mindset. So you need to, every time you write a commit message, you need to tell yourself that it's not about me anymore; it's about us, right? So it's a collaborative mechanism. So Git commit messages are not there to serve you, but to serve others who are reading your code, obviously. Right. So there are some of these common developer conversation, right? So you would have heard about it every day in your company or in your workspace. So can you give me some background about why the code is written over here? And a developer may ask, what feature does this piece of code relate to? And there may be one other developer who says, I have no idea why this condition exists. It seems weird. So all these are relevant communication that we hear now and then, right? So good commit messages can eliminate all these kind of questions that come across, right? So now let me share my experience about writing good commit messages and how a good structure would be, right? So good commit message needs to have this much information, right? It needs to have what that commit message is for, and why are we writing that commit message for, and how are we going to solve that problem that we are addressing with that commit message, and obviously more information, right? So that's a template that I would like to share with you guys, which I worked for me for a quite a long time in my experience at Redbus and as well as in Gojek, so that you guys can have adopt it as well, right? So yeah, so there are majorly three different parts of a good commit message. The first line, which says what is that commit message about? Is it a fix? Is it a refactor? Is it a feature? And there goes a title of that commit as well. And then comes some explanation about this commit message. So why is this? Why are we doing that? And how are we going to solve a particular use case with that commit message? It can be a bug, and you can say how are we going to fix this bug? Why is this bug occurring? So this kind of explanation you can give in the second part of it. And obviously the third part of it can be a tracking ID, right? So some companies may use Jira, some companies may use Asana, where people can go ahead and check more information about that commit. Obviously, if it's a feature, then you can get all the details about the feature in that Jira or Asana. Or if it's a bug, then you may have steps like reproducing steps, or what is the impact of that bug, and all those information which you cannot put inside a commit message. You can put it, you can communicate it via a tracking ID. Right, so here is an example of a commit message that we wrote in some time ago. Right, so you can see that the first line says refactor and optimized movie adapter for smooth scroll. So the first line conveys very straightforward information, telling that okay, this commit is uh, for a refactor, and what we have done over here is we have optimized the movie adapter for some smooth scroll. And further down, you will be able to see that the computation inside the on bind view holder was causing the frame to render So these are some background about that commit message. Why are we doing this? And in the next part, you can see that okay, we are doing some test, and how can we test it? So you are communicating to the one who is reading this commit message, telling that okay, if you want to do something about this commit message, you can go ahead, enable GPU rendering, and go to this option, and you're giving some more information to the developer who is reading this commit message, telling that okay, these are ways that you can test for this commit. And obviously the next one is the Jira ID that you're giving over there, and obviously you can log in into your Jira and go to this particular Jira and see more information about why this commit was required, and all everything that you need to know about this commit, right? Okay, so now that we have a commit message format in place, and if you are working with around 20-30 developers, how can you enforce uniformity that everybody will be using that commit message? So there are a couple of ways to do this, and one of the ways is using Git templates, right? So what we can do using Git templates, right? So you can create a template file, and then you can link it with your Git config, and so that every time you commit, you can be assured that you will follow the commit forever. And so there are a couple of ways of doing it. So the first way they can do is you can create a file called commit message.txt, and the second thing is you can just paste this commit message structure into that commit message.txt file, and then save it, right? And then you can execute this command, which is git config hyphen global commit.template, and then you path to the file that you just created. So what this guy is doing is it is going into the git config, and it is modifying a property called commit.template, and it is pointing the commit.template to the file that you just created, which means that every commit that you do from now on will be following this template. Okay, now let's see what happens if you try to commit after you do this following configuration, right? Now you just type git commit, and this thing appears in your screen, right? So you can right away see that there's a template that is pre-populated for you. Right now, all you have to do is, and all your developers have to do is just edit this template and then hit the save button. That's it. Hit if it is Mac, it will be command escape :ws, and that's it. So the git commit is enforced throughout all the developers that have in your organization, right? So this is a way that you need to do, but there's a caveat to this, because Git is a very client focused application. So you need to go to every developer in your organization and ask them to have this commit. But obviously that can be solved by using scripts that you can ask your developers to execute, where you can write all this steps and automate this as well, right? And there are a couple of spin-offs by following these good strategies. What you can do is you can you can run querying and analytics on your Git logs, right? So once you follow this template for around 3 to 4 months, right? What you can do is you can filter all your git logs by fixes, right? You can ask your you can write a query language which can um, give you all the fixes that were done in the past 1 month. You can give you all the commits that are related to say a feature in the last 3 months. Or you can also query for something like this: what are all the refactors that I have done for the past 3 months? So this kind of querying and analytics would be possible if you follow very unified commit messages, right? And the second spin-off that is a very interesting spin-off, right? So often you hear we use Crashlytics or Fabric. Right now that is deprecated, so we use Crashlytics on Firebase, right? So whenever there's a bug that surfaces, so Crashlytics will give us a warning, or um, it will give us an error on the portal, right? So what if you want to tag that commit to the developer who wrote this, right? So if you remember, in the template we had a tracking ID, right? So that tracking ID can be used to automatically triage the crashes that are there in Crashlytics to the code committers themselves. So it will be a very automated way of triaging errors, right? So an error occurs in production, it comes to Crashlytics, and Crashlytics gives the hook to your one of your servers. Your server knows who had actually committed this line of code, because you know that by the tracking ID, the Jira ID or the Asana ID that the committer has just used, and you can right away track him, tag Jira to the developer as well. So these are some of the spin-offs, and obviously over a period of time your git logs will look very beautiful, and it will not start with a small letter for 50 percentage of your crash, 50 percentage of your commits, and the rest starts with capital casing. So it will be pretty uniform and it will look very beautiful, right? So these are some of the good spin-offs that come aboard with good commit messages. And more often than not, we end up writing commit messages for ourselves, right? So the you will get good commit messages if you have a mind shift change, right? So when you always think about, okay, I'm not writing this commit message just because I need to know what's happening. Rather, you need to have in mind that I'm writing the commit message not for myself, but for others to understand what this commit is doing, right? So you relay as much information as possible in the shortest amount of time. So that should be your end goal when you're writing commit message. So you get this into your mind, and your commit messages will become beautiful right away. Cool. This is a very short session, but I think I relayed the information correctly to you, just like how you're going to relay the Git commit messages to your developers. Yep. So I can be reached over Twitter and LinkedIn. So here are the social media accounts over here. So any questions, you can ping me right away.
Uh, Thank you, Dinesh, for the short session. All of us probably use Git, so I guess it was useful for a lot of people. So, if anyone has any questions, please post them into YouTube comments, and then we'll highlight them over the stream, and then Dinesh can answer it. We'll wait for a few seconds for questions. Okay, so one question is about sharing the PPT. So basically, we'll share the PPTs later through our Twitter channel for all of the sessions. Okay, yeah. Dinesh, question for you.
Okay, so yeah, as far as I know, there is no limit to the uh, description that you can have, and you can have it as detailed as possible. So the more descriptive you are, the more understandable your readers would be. Can you follow the template for git tag as well? Yeah, obviously, because at the end of the day, some companies, they squash all the commits before they merge. So in that case, all your commit messages go for a toss, right? So obviously you can use this commit structure for things like tagging, for raising merge requests, for raising pull requests. So um, this format applies to everything that you can do on Git. Obviously, you
Uh,
can have.
Dinesh, there was a question. So can you look at the stream? I'm highlighting the question on the stream.
Can we use emojis in the templates? I mean, no, I don't think you can. You can obviously use whatever is on your keyboard, but not the graphical stuff. Yeah, I've tried
Uh,
it in the past. I wanted to have it in the past, but I was not able to. Yeah, do let
let
me
me
know if that's possible.
let me highlight another question.
Yeah. Can it be done from? Yeah, obviously it can be done from Android Studio, right? So it can be done from any. See, this is the Git client that you're targeting, right? So if you set it as a global config in your Git, right, whatever client you are using for committing, be it Android Studio, be it source tree, everywhere this gets highlighted. This template comes into picture wherever you're committing, irrespective of what client you're using. It can be Android Studio, it can be source tree, it can be Git Kraken, whatever it is.
Okay, so I see a lot of questions now. I'm gonna highlight one more,
Yeah,
and I guess the rest you can these guys can contact you over Twitter or yeah.
obviously.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so this is the question.
What about merge commits locally? Because setting templates will be hard to enforce this pattern. Yeah, so there are two kinds of configs that you can do. One is global configuration, local configuration, right? So when you see this slide, um, yeah, so you can see that git config hyphen hyphen global, right? So if you replace that with git config hyphen hyphen local, then it becomes a local config. Right. So if you want project specific config, you can do it as a local config. If you want for your entire laptop or entire Mac to be to follow the same template, you can use global config. It's just a simple change that you can do.
Okay, so I guess this is enough for questions as of now. Whoever has any other questions which I can see in the YouTube comments, so please contact Dinesh directly on his Twitter, and he'll be happy to answer all your questions. Thank you, Dinesh, for joining us and presenting the session on Git.
Thanks a
I'll
lot,
be
guys.
yeah, I'll be
Yep. Have
removing
a
you
nice
from
day.
the thing. Yeah.
Cool. Have a nice day.
Okay, so we are done with our first session, and now we are going to move to our next session. Let me just add Amrit to the stream. Hi, Amrit.
Everyone.
Hi. So, should I add your screen now itself?
Yeah, you could do that.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we'll start with our next session now. So let me just introduce Amrit, or I don't think I should. So probably whoever is watching already knows Amrit. So Amrit works as a developer advocate at Google, and he is one of the earliest organizers of BlrDroid. So over to you, Amrit.
Thanks, Adnan. Hey, everyone. This is the first time I'm using StreamYard, so bear with me if I make some mistakes. Uh, I hope everybody is taking the lockdown seriously and is keeping safe and following all the protocols that have been discussed. Today, jumping straight into the topic, I want to talk about Android 11. So Android 11 is in developer preview right now. As you guys, most of you guys might know, this is a good time to kind of learn about this and understand what's there, what you might need to focus on, and how your apps need to kind of adjust to the new changes that are there. So in the session, this is more of an informational session than an instructional session. So I'm gonna point out a few things that you might need to kind of look more deeply into, rather than actually giving you a lot of instructions on how you might want to do things. I'm going to tell you what is available, what might affect you, and things like that. And you guys will have to go ahead and look at the areas that interest you and then apply it back to your code or learn more about it. So by no means this is a complete set of instructions or complete set of features. I'm trying to cover the ones which I thought might be interesting, might be things that will affect apps immediately. Without any further ado, let me start. So I'm going to start with focus areas on Android are the overview of the top features that came about. Mostly the privacy changes are very important, and they are some of the things that I feel will affect your apps more uh, urgently or more quickly. And some of the other interesting features that you might want to kind of apply in order to make your app performance as well as your user experience a lot better for your user base. So looking at Android 11, There were many things that we actually looked at when it is about improving the whole OS itself. But about in this bunch of things that are there, we wanted to focus a lot on the privacy aspect of it, and also in terms of polishing the experience for end users. Now, looking at the timelines, we are already in developer preview 2, nearly a developer preview 3, uh, and this is a great time for you guys to start giving us feedback. A developer preview is basically there so that we understand as Google, we get the feedback from external developers to try out the OS and give us feedback on the changes and how that is affecting their changes. Some of these changes, some of this feedback actually leads to changes in the OS itself. An example would be scope storage. Last year, we introduced scope storage in Android 10, and there was a lot of feedback that came back to the team saying that people needed a little more time in order to adjust their code bases to work correctly with it. That's when legacy request legacy the request legacy mode manifest attribute was added so that people can opt out of it. Once beta releases start rolling out, the number of changes that are made to the OS is reduced, and the focus shifts on to stabilizing it. And then the final release is expected to be somewhere around Q3 end. So in a nutshell, this is a great time for you guys to go ahead, test your apps, understand what is there, understand how these API changes affect you, and then reply and then give feedback, or start looking at if there are changes that impact you, start looking at how you can mitigate some of these changes. What you should do now is basically review the program, understand the key dates and details in each developer preview or each release that we're having. There are changes that are happening. Some new features are added. Sometimes some features are removed. So you want to kind of look at and understand what are the changes that has happened, and go go ahead and keep updating yourself with what is available in the market today. Secondly, set up a test environment or a run environment where you flash one of your devices, set up your emulators so that you can actually go ahead and start working with it. You set up your Android Studio, so download the preview tools, download the SDK, look through the setup guide to understand if there is anything new and additional that you need to do in order to get everything working as expected. Learn about what's new, review the privacy changes, review the features, and that might affect your app. In the first one, what I mentioned was, in the first step, what I mentioned was just get a general understanding of the large areas of changes. In the fourth step is basically understand the areas that actually affect your app, and you might need to make changes. Test your app thoroughly on it. There might be things that you assume. So do not leave it to your assumptions. Do not leave it to just literature. Please go ahead and test your apps on these devices. And also, we have introduced toggle behavior. So you can go ahead and toggle certain breaking changes, because when in the last couple of years, when we have seen our users testing apps or other developers testing their apps, one of the prime concerns has been there is a breaking change. Unless I can fix that breaking change, I cannot test any further into my flow. So in order to mitigate that sort of a situation, there is in the developer option, there are new toggles available for behavior changes, where you could go ahead and toggle off certain features, which will make it work like it was in Android 10 rather than the change in 11, so that you can continue testing without that breaking change affecting you anymore. So please take advantage of this. And lastly, update your app. At this point in developer previews, my suggestion to you guys is to understand what those changes are and identify alternative ways of fixing it. I wouldn't suggest you guys go ahead and change everything immediately. That is because during the developer preview, the system can change quite a lot. There are new changes introduced. There are new behavior changes that might come in. So wait for your changes for the OS to actually go into the beta phase before you actually start applying your changes. It is a great time to kind of understand and figure out what are the other changes that you might want to kind of bring about. Moving on, I'll start with the privacy changes and then jump in to look at other things that we would be discussing. So quickly jumping into the privacy changes. The first one I want to talk about is scope storage. Scope storage is something that got introduced uh, in Android 10. But a lot of feedback came back for the saying that this was a big change, and then a few mitigation steps were given so that people could opt out of it. One of them being request legacy external storage flag, which was given so that you can add this to your manifest, turn this to add this to your manifest, and then set it appropriately so that the app would behave like a legacy device rather than applying the scope storage principles. This was like a bypass to all the changes that were introduced in Android Android 10. Now, one of the things that we've done in Android 11 is to remove this flag altogether. Before that, let me quickly touch upon what scope storage is all about. If you take the app storage, there is internal storage as well as external storage. If you look at the external storage, there is a shared storage space, right? In the shared storage space, if you have the permissions to read or write, you have access to the entire file system. That is what scope storage want to avoid. The intention of bringing this about is to actually protect the app's data as well as the user's private data. With scope storage in place, apps will only be able to access the files that they have actually written, or they have explicit approval from the user to access it. And for things like this also leads to another thing, which is better attribution to the data on the disk. The OS, by that what I mean is the OS has better understanding of what app actually wrote this, and when an uninstall happens, what all files can be removed completely. Now, there are situations where you want to share information, or rather files, between apps, and that is usually in terms of media files. So there are gated stores, media stores for photo, video, music, etc., which are again under a media permission. So you will have to request for a permission before you can access data from these media stores. Now, this was how things worked. And for any file outside of that, so if you want to pick some particular file from your download folder, any file from your download folder, you can use the system picker, and the user will have to give explicit permission for the app to pick the file, and then only it will be allowed. This is how things worked in Android 10. Now in Android 11, with the legacy request legacy external storage flag removed, you don't have the option to opt out of this Android scope storage behavior. What has been introduced with 11 has been that there are bulk APIs to make changes. So if you want to delete or update a few files together, then there are bulk APIs for accessing that in the media store. With media store, if you have, without any permission, the app is able to read its own data, which is any file that it added to the media store, it could read it. But for any file, for all the files that are there in the media store, like all the photos that are there added to the media store, you will have to request for the read permission. Once you get the read permission, you are limited to getting access into each of these media stores. The third one is, like I said, if you want to pick a file, you have to use the system picker, not third-party file pickers. If you are using third-party file pickers, definitely test for scope storage impact, because picking a file to view or to attach to a feature in your application, things like that, will require system picker now. So look for scope storage impact in some of these areas. Moving on, the next one I want to talk about is one-time permission. This is a new permission that has brought in new permission style that is brought in, where you can actually give the permission just for that one instance of usage. By one instance, what it means is if the app is in the foreground or it has a foreground service, if the app goes into the background, then it is, and the foreground service is closed, then it is considered to be that session getting over and the permission is removed. This is useful for places where you want to give your location just once, or you want to take the photograph for your profile picture, which is just used for sign up. But you don't want to give the camera permission for the app throughout the life cycle of the app, right? So this sort of a permission where you're just giving it only for that one session is quite useful. This is not target SDK gated, so you would really need to check your app how this is gonna what happens when users give this. In Android 11, one of the other things that is as a philosophy is that we don't want to nag the user by asking them to asking them permissions again and again. So if the user clicks deny 2 times, that's considered to be deny and don't ask. So please do understand that uh, asking permission should be appropriate. You should provide the rationale and be very clear about how information is shared and appropriate information is shared so that user can make an informed decision by giving you the permission or not. Moving on to service foreground types. This was a concept introduced in Android 10. There was service foreground types for media projection and location, which was something that we had set in. There were other ones also defined, but they were not like they were optional, like syncing data, media player, phone call, device companion. All these other types of foreground services were also provided. But with the location was the one where a lot of people saw impact because that is a more common use case that people use, right? And on top of it, without declaring this foreground service type in your manifest for your foreground service, you don't get the location. The permission is not actually the permission is not given to collect location for the foreground service. So this change was something that people had to make. In 11, we have introduced 2 more, which is microphone and camera. So if you are having foreground services which actually use microphone or camera, you will have to actually add them to your manifest. Otherwise, those permissions are not, that data is not passed to it. If you don't add it, from camera, there'll be no data from the sensor that goes to your app. So you will get null data, or no, from microphone, there will be no audio that is actually passed to your service. Then there is some changes that are there in the UI sessions also for foreground notifications. Now you can actually swipe out foreground notification. What happens is it actually sits in the pane. If you would see at the bottom of the screen, there is a pane called foreground services. So you have for your running services, then your silent services, and then there's a new pane for foreground services. The ones that you swipe out do not go out of your attention. It basically means that they actually get added to the foreground services pane. And when you click on that foreground for services pane, is actually expanded back again. That's what the second and third picture here is actually showing. So that's not something that will affect your app. It is just that the users will be using it this way, and you need to be aware of this as a developer. The other thing with permissions was package visibility. Apps could actually right now go ahead and look for all the packages that are installed on the device as long as the user gives them permission. Going further, this is kind of limited. We have to use the queries element in the manifest to let the system know what apps are you looking for. You could do it 2 ways. One is that you can specifically give the package name. So there are legitimate use cases where you want to understand if another package is there or not. So other app is installed there or not. So you query for that package name and then figure out whether that package is installed or not. If the package details are not found, it's considered to be not installed, and then you take the alternative flow. This is a very common thing that people do it, especially for things like sharing directly to an app and things like that. Now, with with the package visibility restrictions coming into picture, you will have to specify those package names, or you have to give an intent filter that conveys in the query. You have to give the intent filter that conveys the intention. So it could be that you want to share a particular type of file with all the apps, and you're creating a custom share dialog. So you want to know what all apps are installed which can handle that intent. You have to provide that in the query. This gives the OS enough information to understand system enough information to understand that when you query, do you have access to read information about those packages or not. Now, there are instances when you have to query all the packages, and that is hidden under a new permission, or rather that is guarded by a new permission called as query all packages. And this is introduced in 11. So if you have a use case by which you need to query for all packages in the device, you will then have to use this new permission, and the user has to provide this permission explicitly for you. This is a very interesting API, and I think this would be really useful in identifying data access issues, especially in the era where privacy is becoming really, really important. There are a lot of times that we see that apps do get penalized for things that their SDKs that they have added have been doing. There might be a private data access from an SDK that they've added. Unfortunately, the developer did not understand that or did not have any information about it. They deployed it to Play. Play policy found this out, and then there is a ramification because of that. Could be a suspension or a termination of the app. This is quite difficult when you have a lot of SDKs. This is not very easy to understand how some of these SDKs behave. And that is where we have introduced this new data auditing API by which you can identify and rectify potential unexpected data accesses. So you can write a callback which will then give you information about when a private data access is happening, whether it's from your app or from your SDK. Certain places you yourself know that yes, my app does that. You can add contextual information there, so that logs that come in do clearly tell you along with the context. It will be logged along with the context, so that you understand that that is a legitimate use case. This is super useful. It is a new API. I strongly advise people to kind of try this out, and especially when you have apps have a lot of SDKs, this is something that might be very useful to help kind of dig a little more deep into, and can avoid a lot of potential heartaches later. So summarize the privacy changes. I'm just leaving the slide in the presentation so that somebody can look at it and review it later. I'm not going to go through it again and repeat all of what I've said, but have an understanding of this. Look at this sheet before, while you're evaluating if your app has getting impacted by these changes or not. Now let's move on to some of the new features. So in developer preview, we've introduced new tools for testing and debugging your app. One of them is a new compatibility framework. Developers are now able to change individual features on and off so that they can continue testing. So for example, there are quite a few of these things that are available. Say scope storage, you could turn off scope storage and then run your app so that that particular feature is not impacting your current testing cycle. But then what, again, none of these toggles will be available in the public build. It will only be there for the developer previews. Please be aware of that. This is important to understand, because users will not be able to toggle off a certain feature and continue running your app, and that sort of option is not there in the public build of the OS at all. So this is really useful, is because you might be blocked by feature, say a new change one, where and not allowing you to test any of the other changes. So you could turn off change one and then continue testing the impact of change 2, 3, and 4. And you can isolate and test individual behaviors one at a time and identify with great accuracy what all things are impacting you. So please take advantage of this feature. Refresh rates, now apps and games, you might all be aware of, and you've seen many articles and many articles, as well as documentation, docs explaining why the multiple refresh rates and their impact on battery and screen resolution and things like that, or screen clarity and things like that. A lot of games earlier, this was controlled by the system. This when it felt there is a need to kind of bump up the refresh rates, it would, and to kind of power save, it would actually lower the refresh rates for certain operations. Now apps and games can request for choosing these refresh rates. So a game can say that I want to run at 90 hertz, and the device can actually take that information and work with it. And this can be asked from both an SDK option as well as from your NDK. But be cautious when you use it. Do profile your app or your game to understand its impact when you turn on a higher screen refresh rate, and see whether that and ensure this doesn't affect your users adversely. The other interesting change that I've seen was that there is a resume on reboot sort of a thing. As you might all know, there are two types of encrypted stores in Android, which is the device encrypted storage as well as a credential encrypted storage. Most of you, when you reboot your app, you would see that you have to unlock your app for all the apps to receive messages and things like that. So the credential encrypted store access is something that was not there earlier on reboot. Unless the user first logs into the device, the credential store encrypted store is not accessible. Now, with the new in 11, what has happened is what change has been brought about is that there's an improvement for this for OTA installations. So if it is over the air installations, which happen at night, for instance, and the device reboots automatically, there is access to a credential store. So apps will be able to kind of continue to run and receive messages without the user immediately interacting or unlocking the screen. And there is support for direct access for device encrypted storage also, which was there for a long time. That continues to be there. Now, there is a new API for 5G. 5G, like you know, is getting deployed globe in many parts of the globe. India, we still are in the testing phases, but if you're a global app, you will have to understand the impact of this. On a 5G network, the speeds of the network is really high. So you want to take advantage of the improved speed as well as latency to maybe run a better use case, or to kind of do certain operations which otherwise might impact user experience if it's on a slower network. So use this along with the dynamic metered API as well as bandwidth estimator API to kind of give better better user experience for users on 5G. So there is a new API. Please do look through that and see whether how you can improve the experience for users for those who are on 5G networks. Now, on a call screening perspective, there are some improvements. There are new APIs. This is specifically useful if your app is interacting with this particular use case, which is to remove spam and things like that. Apps can now send out rejection details, and they can also customize screen post call screen. Which is a system provider post call screen, but you can actually customize that information so that users can perform certain actions. The other one that you should definitely, your users are not really bothered about, but as developers, we would be excited about is wireless ADB. The command line interface can communicate using ADB from the computer from a wireless perspective. Earlier, this was a cumbersome process of connecting your device to your using a cable and things like that, and so you have to approve that for a particular network on your device. And then if your computer is also running on the same network, you can communicate it, but you can send commands to your device by ADP, maybe push files in there, pull certain configurations out and things like that. There's always a pairing required every single time, and that can be done with QR code or a 6-digit PIN number. This is interesting. I'm hoping that a lot of developers would be happy with seeing this. From a screen recording perspective, we've improved the UI. There is new controls in the pane that actually shows that recording has started. So the notification pane has multiple things like, do you want to stop audio? Do you want to show the touches? Earlier, these settings were there, but then you had to go into developer options and turn them on and off, which was quite cumbersome. So we brought it to a main screen where it's visible. The other change is that the notification that tells you that a screen recording is happening is right now, earlier was the system color and with options. The new one will be red in color so that it is clearly visible and communicating to the user that screen recording is happening, and there are no options added to that anymore. Notification history is another option that is there. There is a dedicated place that you can actually go on and turn on the history. So notifications that you swiped off, you can actually go back, and the users can go back and see that from the notification history pane. It's accessible by a shortcut in the notification shade. This isn't complete. This is there in the developer preview right now, but it's not completely polished and ready for beta. So there might be some design changes or some changes that you will see as the versions actually progress. So to wrap it up quickly, there are plenty of more features that are there. I taken some of these photos from 9 to 5 Google website, but there are new things like the pane, the media store pane, media notification, which actually comes in the settings pane. There is a battery share option that we've seen. There is a screen share new thing, Bluetooth audio codec selection. There are many things, new features that are available. So keep reading more about this at the developer.android.com website. And also, with every release that is coming out, please do update yourself on what has been added, what has been changed, and what are the things that are removed. Please don't assume that things are not going to remove or not going to change. So testing is required with every update of the with every developer preview or beta release. Please do test your apps again. It is important to be aware of these changes so that you can limit the amount of time you're testing. So read up on it, figure out the changes, and ensure those changes don't actually affect you. Reiterating the timelines again, we are in the last phase of developer previews. April is where we are, and developer previews are coming. The third developer preview is coming to the point. Beta releases are about to start, so the amount of changes are going to be limited. And please do test throughout the cycle so that your apps are ready for prime time and final release happens. None of your users who have the latest device with the latest OS are getting a bad experience from your apps. And that's it from me. Hopefully, this was useful. Like I said, this is not an exhaustive list of features that are there, but you really need to see this as a pointer to all the available things, and you can jump in and go in detail for the things that you think are going to impact you or the areas that you want to study more. If you have any further questions, please do ask now or follow me on Twitter. That's the easiest way to reach me. If there are questions, please feel free to post on Twitter. I would be checking that very regularly. Over to you, Jatin.
Thank you, Amrit. Yeah, so we'll take questions now. Please put your questions on the YouTube comments and I'll highlight them over the stream. Okay, let me start with the questions. Yeah, first question, Amrit.
So the question is, if location is allowed only once, how does Zomato travel track?
Zomato probably.
Okay. Yeah. So the whole point is, this is an option that the user can give. For tracking delivery, their delivery executive would have a different app. I presume that is a different app for their delivery executives, and they can provide location full time. That option is not removed. We've added a new one called as give location only once. Even though adding legacy permission voice is not audible on 10. Voice is not audible on 10.
Okay.
Shraddha, I am not sure if I understand this question correctly. Please give me some more details offline and we can discuss this.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll move to the next question.
I'll park it on for now. With the new wireless ADP implementation, the ADP connect command be required, or the device should be connected automatically? You will have to do pairing upfront once, and then it can be connected. It will not automatically let you connect from a security perspective. So there is an the first time authentication has to be, a pairing is done first, and then there is an authentication step every single time you want to kind of go ahead. Once it is authenticated, then you can actually continue the connection. That is the current implementation that I have seen. Things can change. Like I said, this is developer preview. Things will improve. So there might be some changes that will come with that might come with different releases.
Next question.
Where can I get all the detailed description of API and feature updates? Developer.android.com has with every developer preview, we are actually writing blogs with links to the API as well as articles which explain these changes uh, very much in a detailed fashion. So I would suggest you to stick to developer.android.com to start with right now.
Okay. Amrit, next question.
For background location, we have to fill up form and require Google approval. Can you share more details about it? Okay, this is something to do with policy, and that is I can share the details with you offline. But for policy things, I'm not gonna interpret any of the policies for the moment.
Okay. I'll take last question now. Yeah.
Does scope storage apply to device administrator apps? Okay, this is very interesting. Thanks for asking this, Rajiv. There is a different class of applications that might need entire disk access, which is like device administration apps or antivirus apps or file custom file pickers, things like that. Uh, File managers, but they have a special permission that is given, but that is controlled by policy. Unless and until it is the primary purpose of the app, I don't believe it will be approved. This is my understanding of it right now. In terms of the policy part of it, that is my understanding of it right now. Things might change because they have not been approved. I know that technically there is a permission, and that will be guarded by policy, is something that is definitely be there. So the scope storage settings still do apply for all apps technically, but there are a certain class of apps that can get special privilege to get entire access because their use case demands it. For an antivirus app that needs to look through all the files, right? So things like that, and that's guarded by a policy also. So I guess that's the last question, Jatin.
Yeah. We can take one more.
Oh, is it?
I'm
Okay,
waiting
sure.
for, yeah, just one more. We are waiting for Adnan to join the stream, so I'll just highlight one
Yeah,
more
sure.
question. Yeah, yeah.
Like you said, we can be able to understand the track the data access, what kind of data can be tracked using Task Manager. How does it work? So it tells you all your data access part of it. What the details, I think it'll be too heavy to talk about it here. I can share the details with you offline. What I'm going to do with this session at least is I'm going to take all the questions that you guys have shared here. I'm going to create a document, and I'm going to put all the answers. We will share it with VLR to all the people who are here, and using our meetup page, we will actually put all these questions and answers there. Some of this requires me to also look through what is the change that is coming, change that has happened, and update it. And that's why it would be best that I take some of these detailed questions offline. But I will share this information with you, Shubham.
Okay. So I think that's enough for questions. Amrit has already told that he's available on Twitter. So if you have any other questions, you can directly contact him.
And
And yeah,
my
you're also
Twitter
looking
ID, I'm sorry, my Twitter ID is AM Sanjeev. First two letters are my first names, the entire last name, AMSANJEEV. I regularly post on Android, so in case you're interested, follow. Otherwise, if there are questions, feel free to ask.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Amrit, for that informative session about the next version of Android. I'll update the stream now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Hi, Adnan.
Hey, hi.
Hi. So yeah, we'll start with the next session now. Yeah. So I'd like to welcome Adnan here. Adnan works as Android engineer at Zolo Stage, and he's also the organizer of DroidCon India. So if you were there at DroidCon India last year, you would have met him. So Adnan will give a session about Android context. So Adnan, let's start.
Yeah, let me share my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you see?
Yeah. So I have added the screen to the stream. So over to you, Adnan, now.
Yeah. So, good morning, everybody. To begin with, that's the first thing. This is the first time I'm doing a remote talk at all. I'm much more physical, but okay. In that sense, if something goes wrong, please do let me know. If you have suggestions, it would be more welcome to improve. So, today, I would like to talk to you about a topic which, like, everybody knows about, but nobody knows what actually is going on, right? Like, you use it every day in and out, but you don't really know what it really means and what it really does, right? Context is something which a lot of people get confused, and like even after years of doing Android, you still are not sure, okay, what does it really matter, does it not, what. So my motivation behind this talk was to, one day I was my this was, hey, you know what, there are so many types of context and I don't really understand how each of them function, right? Like, I can use them, I can get things to work using the right context, but I don't really know why did one work versus the other, right? So that is when I started to look at what really the difference is and what actually happens internally as well. And this talk is basically entire summary of everything that I learned over the past, that this whatever I went through, whatever I explored, and this in a way wherein you can understand it and make it like have a mental model as to which context and what to use. So we'll see. We'll talk about all of those things in the slides. So let me begin off by something simple, right? Very, very simple. What is context, right? If somebody asked me that question, I would say it is pure magic, because I don't know anything that I want to do in Android. It requires a context. I pass it and it gets done. I don't need to think about it twice, but yeah, that is what I would describe it as. But in actual reality, context is basically a global state of information of your application at any given point of time. I'm pretty sure you have heard of this a lot of times in the past. You have probably tried to find more, but there is not much out there in terms of context related info. While it is true that it is just a state of your current application, but there are different types of context, right? Like, context as a whole is not the same. Like, there is an application context, there is an activity context which you have. So context basically is, think of it as a state of information for you based on different levels of the application. So think of application level as a state of information, global state of information, whereas at an activity level, you would be restricting it to that particular screen. We'll see how that makes a difference and why is that difference important as well. So even before we go there, right, why do you even need the context? You have to access resources, that is, context is going to help you do that. You want assets of your application, context again. If you want to access a system service, which is like a Wi-Fi manager, vibration control, notification service, all of those things, you still use the context to get access to it. You could read file paths and this. You could start activities, services, broadcast using a context as well. So any component basically that Android has is done and started using the context. Looking at this, what you can figure out already by now is context is required for majorly two things. One is accessing components and elements of your own app, and it also is required to access components and stuff of other apps as well. So let's say you want to communicate to a secondary app, you would still need context. Let's say you want to access the operating system level service, right, like a Wi-Fi manager service, you would still need context. So basically context is that communication layer between different components between your own within your app and outside your app as well. So that is why you would need context. I'm pretty sure you use these on a day-to-day basis, start activity, start services and broadcasts just like that. So that is what context provides in terms of functionality to begin with. So coming to that question, right, like there are so many types of context. you have your application context, you have something called as the activity context, you have something called as base context that is there as well. Then you have something called theme context. You have the very famous this. You could do a this dot, and a lot of things work with that as well. There is the not so famous that. So yeah, what I mean to say is there are so many types that it is very easy to get confused, right? Which to use, when to use, how do I even start making sense of all of these, and why are there so many contexts to begin with, right? Like, why couldn't it not be, we could just have one context and just get done with it, right? So in reality, there are the type of contexts that actually matter as a developer to you are just two types. One is a UI context, and the second is a non-UI context. So what I mean to say by this is all these contexts which we saw previously can largely be grouped as a UI context or a non-UI context. So we'll look at what the difference between UI and non-UI context is. But ideally, remember this: you only, as a developer, you only care about whether it is a UI context or a non-UI context to begin with. Even before we kind of try to get into UI context and non-UI context, let's quickly look at what the class hierarchy looks like. Like I was very curious to understand what implementation looks like, what happens where. So you have your base class, which is the context class. This is an abstract class, no implementation at all. Context wrapper extends the context class. Again, no implementation, does not really give much out. And then you have application class, the service class, the context theme wrapper, which extend the context wrapper. So the application and the service class here extend the context wrapper and not the context theme wrapper. And context theme wrapper is basically where the first set of implementation starts coming into picture. Like what is happening is the context theme wrapper has some functions which are overridden and say, hey, get resources, get theme, and all of those things. And your most favorite component, activity, extends the context theme wrapper. So with this in mind, this is just, don't get hooked on the details. I showed you this thing just to help you understand the hierarchy, because now when we talk about UI and non-UI context, you will start to realize what I mean by UI and non-UI context. So the context class and the context wrapper by themselves are non-UI context. They do not have anything to do with theming or this. So as per the previous diagram, your application class and the service class instances are non-UI contexts. Whereas context theme wrapper is a UI context because it has information related to theme. Think of it as your UI context is nothing but the regular context with your application theme on top of it. So this enforces that your themes are basically, it gives you theming for all your views and stuff. So context, UI context is just that. It is as simple as that. Now that you know, the difference between what I mean to say between UI context and non-UI context, let's see how you differentiate so I know your question immediately, right? How does it make a difference? Like what difference does it make if the theme is there, not there? So as I said, UI context is just context plus your theme. The theme which you define in your manifest file will automatically be picked by the system if you provided a UI context. If you do not provide it a UI context, let's say you provide it a non-UI context, what is going to happen is your theme is going to be ignored and the system default theme by the OS is going to be picked. So let's look at how you can, all ways you can get hold of this UI context, right? So the very first obvious one is activity. You can do a this, which will return you the instance of the activity, and that is a UI context, right? Because it extends the context wrapper, theme wrapper. On the fragment, you could call something like get context, and it would still give you back the activity context. This is assuming that you started the fragment using a fragment transaction manager and and you didn't create the fragment or this by any other means. On any view, you could do get context, and it will give you back the UI related context as well. One caveat though that you need to keep in mind here is you can create views programmatically. And when you say, let's say as an example, a very simple example, say text view, new text view is equals to new text view, you pass in this most of the times. But what you could also pass in is the application context instead of the activity context. So what you just did there was you created a view, but passed in the application context to it. And when after that, if you call get context, what is going to be returned to you is the application context and not the view UI context. So you effectively have a non-UI context on the view if based on the how the view was created for you. Similarly, let's look at what non-UI context basically means for you, right? How you access the non-UI parts of it. So in the activity, again, you could just call get application context or get application. That would return to you the application global application context. This is a non-UI context because it does not really have anything to do with your UI or theming or any of that stuff. Within a service, you could also call get application context or this, which returns the instance of the service. And as we saw, the service basically extends the context wrapper and not the context theme wrapper. So what happens is it has no information related to basically anything to do with your theming or UI. And it makes sense as well, right? Like as a service, there is no way you can do anything related to the UI, right? Your services are supposed to be background long running tasks. So makes sense that you don't have to, this is a non-UI context to begin with. You could get access to a context object from anywhere. It could be activity is this, and you could do a dot get application on context on that object, and it will return you back the global context which we just spoke of. So for a broadcast receiver itself does not have a context as such. So when you get on receive, when you get the call back, a context is being passed to you. So basically what happens here is broadcast receiver is not really capable of having a context of its own, but it is just being passed to you, which you can use. We'll look at more details of this broadcast receiver because it is a very interesting and like a special type of context that gets passed to it in this as well. By now you're already thinking, right? Like, does it really matter? UI, non-UI context, why do I care? Like I could pass either of them and everything still works for me. And you would probably be right in saying that, to be honest. Like most of the cases, what is going to happen is if you pass application non-UI context to a UI based context, there is not much that is going to break. It is not going to crash for sure. It is not going to create any problems or throw an exception or anything. But the way each of these contexts works and the amount of flexibility and accessibility and the control and power these contexts have is slightly different. I say slightly because most of them are able to do majority of the tasks with a regular context, UI or non-UI. But there are special things that a UI context can do which application context cannot, and vice versa as well. So we'll look at a few of them as to how does it make a difference. So let's try to understand which context would you use, and why would you use a particular context versus something like why not just stick to one context, right? So let's look at something very simple, right? The application context. We have probably used this everywhere in our app, like get application context. You do it to initialize a lot of things. All of those things are there. So application context in itself is a singleton instance within the same process. What this means is it is a singleton across your app if you have a single process. If you have multiple processes, then there are two application contexts, separate instances which are with different processes in total. So since this is a singleton instance, what happens is you calling get application context from anywhere across the app on any object will always return you the same instance. This is one singleton which is stored across your entire application lifecycle. So irrespective of how many times you call it or from where you call it, it is still going to return you the exact same instance and with the same set of information. This, as we already know, is a non-UI context because this is long-lived. It does not have anything to do with UI or theming to begin with. Plus, this context is global to the entire application, does not depend on any of the life cycle of any of your other components. The only thing it depends on is the actual app life cycle itself. Apart from that, it does not really care where you use it from, where you call it from. You'll be able to access it pretty much everywhere you can think of. Whereas, let's look at what this activity or a service context is, right? Like, this is within your activity or a service, you get access to a context as well, right? What does that look like? So every time you have this, it is a unique instance per activity or per service for that matter. So what I mean to say it as unique instances, let's say you create two instances of the same activity at two different points of time. The context, you could just say get context or do this, and you would get back the context object. The two context objects which you got back will be different because they are very unique instances created at an activity or a service level. So every time you spin off a new activity, a context implementation is created along with it, and that provides the actual context object to it. So one thing to remember here is this is not unlike our application context, which is long lived and does not care where it is created, where it is being done. This is very specific to the activity or the service which you are trying to access it from, and is unique to only that activity or service. You cannot access this context outside of this activity's life cycle or this service's life cycle. You can, in a way, if you show references, but that context would still be pointless because it would not be active if the screen or the service is no longer active as well. The way you would access it is just call this, and you should get access to both of them. The activity context which you get in return when you click on this, when you call this or get context, is a UI context, because if you remember, the context theme wrapper is the parent for this activity class, and context theme wrapper is our UI context which has UI theme related changes. So this is a UI context. But whereas the servers, as we saw, is not the context theme wrapper, but it extends the context wrapper in general. It is a non-UI context. And as I have already mentioned, it does not really make sense for the service to have UI related context, right? Because there is not any UI element to the service that you could play around with. So coming to the broadcast receiver context, right? As I told, this is not really a context of its own, like how we have with activity, services, and application. Broadcast receiver context is a little special, wherein it is being passed to it in on receive, where every time you get a new on receive being called, a new unique instance per call is being passed to you. So if the same broadcast receiver is fired at multiple points of time, the context object which you receive will be unique and different from the previous one which you had. So it is being passed to it as an argument. So yeah. This is also a non-UI context because you can't really do anything UI related in a broadcast receiver. So this is again a non-UI context, does not have anything to do with the theming or the UI part of it. What is special about this context is you get something called as a receiver restricted context. What this is a type of context, but it has everything that the regular context would have. But there are two methods which are disabled, like those being the register receiver and bind service. I am pretty sure it is very obvious as to why this is there, because you can't. It would be an infinite loop, right? If you keep registering receivers within the receivers on receive. So yeah, and you can't really bind to a service from on receive. So apart from these two functions, basically the context behaves as any other context. It's just that it is disabled. These two functions are disabled, and you can't really have access to call these functions from a broadcast context. So next comes the question, right? Base context. All of that is okay. We saw what really is base context, right? Like this is probably one of the most less spoken about context. Probably you have never even used it. You know it exists, but you never had a use case wherein you would want to understand what a base context is or use it. Like most of the times, your application or your activity context should take care of majority of your use cases you have. But then why have this base context, right? Like what purpose does it serve? think of it as a delegated implementation of the actual context, right? This is that real context which is created based on whatever you are trying to access. So in case of an activity, what happens is your base context is set to be the activity context itself. And that is why even if you do this or you do get base context, you get the exact same UI context, because in that case the base context is set to be the activity context itself. I know this is a little tricky, the wordings, the delegated implementation of the context. I have a slide in a couple more minutes, which will try to help you understand what base context is and why and where does this make sense in that sense as well. One important thing is looking at the source code. If you see, this can only be set once. Once a base context has been set, it can't be set again. If you try to do that, then what happens is the system throws an exception saying that it is already set. So you can't, it is just that you say, hey, you know what, this is my base context, and you do it only once. And after that, there is no way you can change it unless, of course, you recreate the activity or like go through the whole creation cycle again. So there are two ways wherein you could set your base context. One is you could override something called as attach base context function and give it whatever context you want, or you could create a new context wrapper object and then pass in the context. Whatever context you pass in will now become the base context. This will become clear when I show an example with context wrapper, what it is trying to do and how. You will get to understand why base context exists and what is the use case and why, like to begin with, was it even needed to have it in the first place. So you then have the very famous get context method, right? Like you can call this from practically everywhere. So what does this return? Like, is it a unique instance? Is it a singleton instance? So the answer is it depends, right? It depends where you are and what you are trying to call from. So as an example, let's say if you created a view programmatically, passed it the UI context, which is the activity, then it would return you the UI context. But let's say you created the same view programmatically, but with application context to begin with. So what now get context would return is, will give you the application context which you gave it. It will not give you the UI context. It will return you a non-UI context. So it really depends as to what, from where you call this and how you are calling this. But most of the times get context should return you a UI context. The idea here is basically you get access to the context whichever is in the nearest to you at this point of time, whether it is an activity or a fragment or something like that. So it gives you the closest context which you have available to. So we'll quickly go through a couple of cases as to understand that what I just said, right, in terms of differences between these contexts and UI context and this. You are still wondering, like, all of that is fine, but okay, do I really need to bother about it? Here's where things start getting a little tricky, right? So in this example, assume that this code is in a simple activity. What I'm trying to do is start a new activity, plain old start activity, right? Nothing fancy, create an intent, test activity.class. In this example specifically, which I have shown here, I have passed the activity context to the intent. That you could pass it the application context as well. It would not make a difference. It does not really care. What is the limitation in terms of actually starting an activity using the application context is, if you try to do this application context dot start activity, passing in the intent, it throws a runtime exception saying start activity from outside of an activity context requires the flag activity new task flag. Is this really what you want? So as an application context, since it is a non-UI context, right, it can't start a UI element. But again, there are caveats and tricks to it. As the error very helpfully says, you could also pass it a flag called flag activity new task, and it will just work. You can actually do that, and it actually works as well. It is not a problem. The thing is, it does not, when you do flag activity new task, what happens is the new activity becomes your base starting point of the new backstack itself. All the other information is no longer there. One of the reasons why you can't start a new activity with an application context without this flag is that because the starting activity needs to have information. Like, as I said, context is just global information or local information which you have and which is helping communicate. The next activity needs to know the previous activity to have a backstack and maintain all of that. But the moment you do application context or start activity, what happens is the new activity does not know where you came from. Like, there is no context, local context which was passed. You just have a global context saying at an application level, start this activity. So what they did is they throw a runtime exception, but if you add this flag, then sure, you can go ahead and do it. But that is not the use case which you would want in most of the cases, right? You would not want your backstack to be gone just because you started using an application context. So that is, you would generally use activity context, UI context here to start the activity. So it is very simple. Like, this is what you can begin with. This is the error. If you want to try this, please do. Just note one thing, that there is a bug in Android 7 and Android 8, which basically does not enforce this behavior. What happens is you could just write the exact same piece of code which I have here and try to start an activity from the application context, and it will very happily start the activity without requiring the flag activity new task. Don't just get misguided. It is just a bug in those two versions. Android 9.0 and above again enforces this as a strict this, and anything below Android 6 and below Android 6.0 also enforces this as an error at a runtime. So this is where things start to get tricky. Like, this was very surprising to me, right? Because if an activity can start a different activity with a UI context, why not application context, right? Like, that is one of my major questions that I started off with for this entire topic was that, right? Like, why have that restriction? Like, application context is supposed to be this god object, right, as we call it, that, hey, you know what, you can do everything with it. But then when it comes to UI related tasks, this is one example of starting an activity, but you can't even start something like a dialogue with an application context. You can try the exact same thing, right? Like, create a dialogue passing in the application context and try to do a BlrDroid show, and it will not be able to run it as well. It will give you a runtime exception. So things now start to get clear as to why the segregation between UI context and non-UI context. So everything that you have to deal with the UI, the easiest way to go about it is remember that you're doing this only for the sake of UI, this, right? So you would use a UI context to do something which is UI related. There is ways wherein you can do, I'll show one more example wherein we'll see how a UI related task can be done without having a UI context and what implications does that bring as well. So second example is very simple, plain old singleton, which we are used to. This is just basically holding a reference to the context, right? So nothing fancy. I check get instance. If it is already there, then return it, else just create a new passing in the context whichever the user passed, and hold on to that reference, right? This is tricky because since you accept a context object, right, this context could be anything. Like, anybody could call this class and pass in any context they want. I could pass in a UI context, I could pass in a non-UI context. And what that leads to is problems, right? Because if somebody passes you the activity context here, because that is the easiest thing, right? Like, you create a singleton and it says the function is asking for a mandatory parameter which requires a context. You say this, and it will happily accept it, right? Like, no problems. And we do that most of the times, right? It is you are playing around with a third-party SDK which says it requires context in the init function. You just pass it this wherever it is. You don't care. What that happens though is, if the SDK is doing something like this, holding a reference to the context, this would effectively means if you pass a UI context here, you would hold reference to the entire views related with that UI context, that activity. And since this is a static singleton class, what would happen is you would keep holding that reference and leak memory everywhere across your application. Memory leak is something which you might not notice to begin with, like especially with phones getting so much higher with 6 GB, 8 GB RAMs today, memory leaks are not that much of a problem. But what can happen is this can bottle up and keep growing with the usage of the app and the OS itself, and eventually lead to a crash. And it is very tricky that you would not, these are things which you would do, and these are bugs which you would not notice when you are in your development phase. But all of a sudden, when you go to production and there are users having crashes randomly, and you are like, I have no idea why this is crashing. I asked for a context, you gave it a context. What more do you want? So one of the things that you need to remember is ensure that anytime you are trying to hold a reference to a context, make sure it is a weak reference, especially. You don't want to hold a strong reference anyways. Even if it is a weak context, make sure that you kind of use a non-UI context to hold reference. It is generally the safest bet, unless specifically you want to do things which are UI related. Like, let's say as an example, calligraphy is one third-party library which deals with fonts. So what they have to do is render fonts and UI, right? So they need access to your context, and holding a reference to your UI context does not really make sense, right? So the way the calligraphy works today is, as a very oversimplification of what they do, is attach themselves as the base context. We saw what I was talking about, base context, right? This is a very good use case for base context. What they do is they say, hey, you know what? Take this context and make me the new base context. So every time, everything that is happening via the context now goes through calligraphy's own context. So they can modify. That is how they are able to modify your fonts and the text sizes and everything on the fly at runtime, because they set themselves as the base context. Again, that is a trade-off, because it depends, do you want the library to have such access? So every time, next time if you're trying to think if a library is asking you for a context object, think if it requires a UI context. Does it do anything related to UI, or does it access system resources of that sort? So things like that, right? Like, think about, just before you pass that context, think for a minute whether you should be passing it a UI context or a non-UI context. If you are the SDK developer yourself, and you have to, for some reason, hold this as your implementation and hold a reference, the simplest way to do it is, if you don't need anything UI related, what you could do is call get application context on this context object itself. So what this does is, you always hold a non-UI context. So irrespective of the context passed to you, you do context.getApplication context. So that way you are 100% assured that you will never have a UI context and you will never do a memory leak. So that is a better singleton. I don't really prefer singletons holding references to context object. I don't think there is a very genuine use case for doing that. There are always ways you can avoid doing that. But if you have to do it, then please do context.getApplication context and hold on to the non-UI context. That way you would not be leaking memory. It is not the best singleton out there, but it is much better than this dangerous one wherein you could just leak memory for all your users without even them knowing about it, because they have no clue what type of context do you need, and do you hold a reference to it or not as an SDK. So it would be very helpful. I really appreciate third-party SDKs which have docs which say why it uses the context and why does it need it, and is there a way wherein I can opt out of not doing it? Is there a way to initialize it without passing it a context? So a lot of analytics SDKs also do this, wherein they require you to pass context. Most of the times, these analytic SDKs have a function which accepts it without the context as well, at a cost of having reduced functionality. It depends how they have structured it, but most of them should have a non-contextual option as well. So yeah, so this is where it starts getting fun, right? So I told you we'll see an example wherein you can create a UI with a non-UI context, right? And what happens? So very simple layout inflator, your favorite. You keep inflating views using it. It says layout inflator.from, where, and in the from is where you pass the context, right? You pass in, hey, you know what, this is the context you should use. Instead of passing in this or the local UI context, what happens if I pass in an application, get application context here, and inflate the view just as I would? So this does not crash. This will work. This will absolutely work fine. It will work and run on your application without any problems. The only thing that happens is, since this is a non-UI context, you lose all the theming support with it. So if you inflate any view, or if you create a view programmatically passing in an application context, you will lose theming. What I mean by you will lose theming is, very simple example is, have a recycler view or a list view, set it up, and instead of passing in the activity context, pass in the UI application context. The text, instead of being black, will be white, because it, and if that is assuming you chose the light theme in your manifest. What happens now is, it is not honoring your theme, but is actually picking the system theme, default system theme. So what happens if you do pass a non-UI context to any UI related things? You lose theming. That is all there is. That will not result in a crash. It will work perfectly fine, but you will lose theming. So next time when you're running something and you see, you know what, my views are not being themed properly for some reason, you could be passing a non-UI context. It can be very helpful to debug, as to understand, hey, you know what, somebody, in this case, right, application context, this could have been just passed to you from some other class, and you are just using context. Remember, all of these are, the super class is still context, so it will happily cast it automatically without having to deal. So sadly, there is no differentiation as, hey, you know what, this is a UI context and this is a non-UI context. That would have been great in terms of as an OS itself, but since context is your parent class, what ends up happening is, it will accept any context which you pass, application, UI, non-UI, whatever it is, and you still will, then you lose theming support of that sort. So we saw what can go bad, but this also is an opportunity if you are smart about it. So leverage this information and knowledge to your own advantage. So let's say, as an example, right, you want your dialogue to look different. So let's say your app is all light, in white colored, light mode, but you want the dialogue to be black because you want that contrast to happen. So one thing is, of course, you can create the dialogue in the layout, go ahead, change the colors manually, keep doing that everywhere where you want the dialogues. One other way of doing it is, define your new theme, which is the contrasting black theme, and then create a context theme wrapper object, passing in the actual context of the activity which you want it to be, and the theme which you want it to be themed for. So now what happens is, if you create your object of context theme wrapper, what it does is returns you back a context theme wrapper. And since the parent class is context again, you could just do alert dialog builder and pass in the new context theme wrapper object which you created, and do a builder.show. This will automatically theme your dialog to be the theme which you provided, and will not pick the system theme or the set theme which you have already been doing. So this can come in very handy, wherein if you have a view, custom view, which you want to theme differently, any view element for that matter, right? If you want to theme them differently, this is very simple. Nothing to do at all. Just declare it as a theme, and everywhere where you're passing it, instead of passing it the context, just create a new theme wrapper object and give it that, and it will automatically start showing your new theme. So it also helps wherein if you have two dialogues, one after other, and you want them also be to theme differently, like all different themes altogether, you can go crazy, add as many styles as you want. You could pass them along as well. If you have buttons which you want to be themed differently, this is again what you would do. It is simpler to deal with. So we saw about get base context, right? This is where it starts becoming clear. So we just saw how you could create a theme wrapper, pass in the existing context you have, and then you could pass in the theme, and it will give you the new context, right, which you can work with. Now, if you call get base context from anywhere where this context theme wrapper object is being used, it will return you the instance of this original context you have, not the new context, themed context, but this original context which you passed in. So let's say you did this in an activity for a dialogue, and then you call get base context. What happens is you get access to the activity's original context and not the new context, theme wrapper context which we created. That is why the get base context exists as a functionality. You will never use this in a day-to-day use case, but if there is a use case wherein you're working in a themed context and you somehow want access to the older non-themed or the default theme object, you could use get base context, and anything that you do on top of this will automatically scale and basically apply those themes correctly. So you can switch your themes on the fly without having to do this. The only caveat you need to keep remembering is you can do this, sure, but if you want to change your theme across multiple elements, you'll have to do this across multiple elements or pass this across them, all of them manually as well. So that is the drawback, but this is why the get base context as a functionality exists. Like, you will never use it, but if you ever have that use case wherein, hey, you know what, I'm in a theme dialogue which I have custom created, but I now want the original theme for some reason, then you could do a get base context and it will return you an instance of that. So now we saw theming, right? Let's try to do something which is a very big pain point for a lot of people, right? Like, your resources configuration, right? You want to set your custom locale to something else, UK, English, French, whatever your wishes. So now the thing is this, right? You either, one way of doing it is you reload all your configurations from scratch, create your activity and give it change, accept this, change the system level locale, and that will reflect. But what if you wanted to access a different locale from there which exists, but you don't really care about the current one, right? So in that case, what you could do is you could do get resources.get configuration and set whatever the locale you are interested in, basically to understand. Let's say you want to change the language to French. Now there is a very handy function called as create configuration context on the context object itself. So you could call this anywhere from a activity or this, and pass in the configuration which you just created. What this does is basically gives you back a context for sure, but what it also does is applies the configuration which you just set. So you could change locale, you could change colors, you could change themes and everything. You could mix and merge, you could have a theme and this and create a context. Now what happens is, with this context object, whenever you try to access things, it will automatically pick the resources and the themes which are tied with this configuration and the context which was created. And if you do the this dot get access to something else, it will give you the original elements which you intended to begin with. So now in the same activity, you could access both two different locales just by having access to this context object. So this is very handy, wherein, let's say, as an example, let's look at Google Translate, right? You have a left side which is in a different language and a right side which is in a different language. And if you want to do things like, hey, you know, this should be French, this should be English, this can be very, very helpful, that you can use this context and pass in French here and say, the text which you are rendering will use this context, and the text which the user is inputting will use the original context, which is English. So this solves your problem very easily. I absolutely love the fact that we could play around with these and mix and match the themes and configurations based on your need, and there is nobody stopping you to creating multiple objects of these contexts, right? Like, you could say one is French, one is German, one is this, one is colored, one is non-colored, with that combination. So you could go crazy with this and it would still work. And based on your use case, this can come in very, very handy when needed. So this is also very fantastic, right? Like, this is the exact same thing which we saw in what could go wrong when you are using an application context, but it could also go well in your ideology. So let's say, for whatever reason, right, you want this layout progress bar to be the default theme. You don't want the theme which you want have applied everywhere else. Ideally, what you would do is then go ahead, manipulate this, change colors, change fonts and everything, right? But what you could now do is you could just give it a non-UI context and you should lose theming altogether and switch back to the default theme. So this is very nice because there might be elements which you don't want to be themed according to your current theme for whatever reason, like as a requirement. And then at that point of time, you could leverage your knowledge of UI and non-UI context to just do this, right? They could pass it a non-UI context, and what will happen is it will not apply your theme which you have set in the manifest file. So this is a very fancy way of ignoring the themes as well. So if you want to ignore themes on certain layouts, certain views, feel free to go ahead and use a non-UI context. But also remember that if you pass a non-UI context, you will lose theming altogether. So you need to be very careful and very judgmental as to what you're doing when you're trying to use a non-UI context to create views. So we spoke about UI and non-UI context. Hopefully that has now made very clear sense to you. Like as a developer, you don't care about get application context, this, get context, all of those. All you care about whether it is a UI context or it is a non-UI context to begin with. So, but now the question why you're wondering, right? Like all of that is fine, Adnan, but how do I still decide which to use when? How do I decide when if I should use a UI context or if I should use a non-UI context, right? If you need access to UI related stuff, go ahead and use UI context. It is as simple as that, right? Like if you're creating views, most of the time you would want the views to be themed according to your theme. So please use a UI context. The UI context could be accessed anyway, various ways we saw. It will work the same. If it is a long-lived operations or non-UI related operation, it might actually be a good idea to always pass it a non-UI context. So what happens if it is a long-lived operation, but you pass it a non-UI context, right? Let's say you're downloading a file and it required a context. You said, hey, you know what? Go ahead and pass it the application context. I don't want to leak memory. That will work if the file operation happens in a very given time frame and everything works. Everybody is happy, nothing works, nothing breaks. But what if the file download continues longer than the activity? So maybe the user switched the activity after you passed in the UI context there to the long-lived operation. Now, what happens is it is now holding a reference to that activity or the UI context, whichever was passed to it. So you would end up with a memory leak. So it is always recommended, if you know that this is a background operation, non-UI related, please pass in the application context. A non-UI context is what you would pass. This makes it much easier to deal with. It is, as a mental model also, it works very nicely. Hey, you know what, anything in the background or long-lived, apart from which, if you want to survive it across multiple screens, use a non-UI context. If you're not sure if this operation will be long-lived or not, you don't know, in case of a third-party SDK, right? You don't know what the SDK is doing, whether it is UI or non-UI operation. Start off with passing it a non-UI context, right? Because the worst that can happen when you pass off a non-UI context is you will lose theming. The app won't crash, at least. If you pass it a UI context, what happens is you would effectively be leaking memory in short. And I always recommend why to start with a non-UI context is tracking, seeing losing theming and seeing those changes is much easier than tracking memory leaks in Android, right? Like it is much easier. Like all you lose is a color of the text changes, that is all. Then you can always go back and pass this a UI context, because hey, you know what, that SDK is using the UI context to theme my views. But if you pass it a non-UI context to begin with, and it holds reference to it, what happens is you'll end up with a memory leak. And in your dev phase, you would not even come to know that something like this is happening, because as a developer, you don't really use your application along with the other applications on a day-to-day basis, right? You're worried only about your application, that particular activity. You test the behavior, it is done, you move on. But for a user, that is not the case, right? It is one of the million apps that he has on his phone, and they could end up fighting for memory and eventually end up leaking memory and causing a crash as well. So this is all. To summarize everything, right? This is what I would say if you had to walk away today. from this talk. Don't think of context in terms of application-based context or all of those things. Just remember there are just two types: UI context, non-UI context. UI context for everything that is going to be UI related and not very limited to that screen and life cycle activity of this. Whereas if you have an operation or background thing which don't really require any UI interactions, then probably it is a much better idea to pass with non-UI context. So there are quite a few references which I used today for this talk, right? When I was going through these, by far are things. These three are the ones which I think have done an excellent job of explaining the differences and what happens when. Especially Dave Smith, the last one from Possible Mobile. This has a diagram and a table which says which context is allowed to do what and what can happen, what cannot. It is very helpful to look it up. But I am hoping that after today's talk, you don't really would need to look that table up, because it should be pretty clear to you right now if you have to use UI context or non-UI context to begin with. So yeah, that is all I had for today. You could reach out to me on Twitter for any other questions, anything at all if you want to speak to me.
Thanks, Adnan, for that deep dive into Android context. I already see a lot of questions, so I'll start highlighting them one by one.
Oh, before we start questions, right? I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
one question which is everybody's thinking. Did I wear pants today? Yes. So let's get that clear. And then, yeah, we can take more questions now.
Okay. Yeah.
Who creates context implementation when I create a activity instance? The operating system is responsible for creating this context implementation. If you see, there is no context. Actual implementation of this is not part of this itself. The OS at runtime decides and creates a unique instance of the context implementation class for each instance when an activity is created. So it is abstract. Just to give you a little idea, right? The way context is an abstract class. Think of it as an interface which the OS has created, and the implementation is provided based on whatever the actual context is being passed to. Like activity will have a different implementation, a service will have a different implementation, because that is the difference between them, right? UI context, non-UI context, and the context implementation class takes care of all of those things. Yeah.
Okay. Next question.
What is the scope of broadcast? Can we start a work manager job from broadcast context? Okay, scope in terms of this, it can do pretty much everything apart from register a broadcast receiver or bind to a service. A work manager class, I don't think will work, because it is in a way trying to again achieve the same operation which you are trying to do, right? Like internally, work manager would use a combination of FCM jobs and all of those things. And bind service is something which you can't call from the broadcast receiver as well. So I don't think creating a work manager job from this will work. I have never tried this, but yeah, interesting question. I honestly don't think this will work.
Okay. Next question.
Getting like what context will get context in view holder and parent dot get context in on create of view holder. So this is, so whenever you call get context, remember this, it will return you the nearest context it has access to. So as an example, right, whatever context you passed in while creating the recycler view is the context you will get within the recycler view. So you could, if you pass like application context, this context will be an application context. If you pass in a UI context or activity context, then this will be a activity context for you. So think of it as a simple rule. It is very simple. Whenever you are calling get context, it will give you the context with whatever it was created with. So it could be a view, it could be a recycler view, it could be a regular custom view which you have. If you create it programmatically and pass in application context, then it will give you the application context. But if you pass in just a UI context and regular activity, it will be a UI context. So that is where it is tricky. You need to ensure that you are on the right path, wherein you understand what context you have passed in is what you get. That is very important to remember.
Okay. Next question.
Get context and require context. So I'm not really sure because get context will for example, right? This also depends because get context, if you create the fragment via the fragment transaction manager, passing in the activity context will return you the activity context. If you create the fragment in some other way, then you will not get access to the activity context specifically. Require context, I'm not sure what it will give you back. I have never tried this. I will probably look at this and get back to you.
So I can answer that. I think require context is something which came after, since get context returns a nullable type of context.
Right.
So require context was added in the support library to make sure the context which it returns is not nullable. So basically, it internally calls get context only, but if the context is null, it will just throw an illegal argument exception. So
Okay.
it's just a redirection so that you don't get nullable contexts. Okay, I'll take one last question now. Yeah, this looks interesting.
Okay, so this is very interesting how you set the base context, right? So calligraphy does this via saying using the attach base context method. What they do, ask you to do in your application class, right, is call attach base context and pass in their wrapper on top of it. So if you look at the documentation for calligraphy as well, there is a section called as injection into context. What they do is basically take in the context in the application class itself, wrap themselves as the new context and say attach the base context. So what that lets them do is become the base context once and for all. So even before your activity is created in the application class itself, they have set themselves as the base context. So with that, there are two things that happen, right? One is they get access to your context, original context which you passed in, and they also get access to their own functionality on top of this. And basically, as an end user, right, it does not really make a difference to you because you get both the context related objects and the calligraphy related things. Calligraphy basically sets itself as the base context in the application class. If you see the documentation wherein it says how to get this started, it gives you two options. Either you could extend their class itself, which basically again does internally, they extend the context wrapper and then wrap themselves as the base context. Or you could go ahead, initialize it in your application, give it your context, and they have this function called inside attach base function. What they do is they call super.attach base function and say calligraphy.wrap the context which you passed in. So what it does is takes the context, creates a new context theme wrapper, wraps itself as the new context and sends it back as the base context to the original this itself. So that way it is only set once in your application level and everything else works as it is.
Okay, I think we'll stop the questions now. Adnan has shared his Twitter ID, so basically, if you have any other questions, you can directly contact him. Thank you, Adnan, for your talk.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. So with this, we'll like to conclude this meetup. I really like the comment section this time. Like we are trying to interact with everyone, although we are in different cities. We have participants who attended from various cities and even outside India. So this was really great. I hope you're all staying safe, maintaining social distance, and washing your hands before Gradle builds. So do subscribe to this channel. We are gonna push out more contents in coming months with more speakers. And in the description of the video, we'll have URLs for our Slack, Meetup, and Twitter. So follow us on Twitter, join our Meetup and Slack community, and you will remain updated on all on the next set of events. URLs for our Slack, Meetup, and Twitter. So follow us on Twitter, join our Meetup and Slack community, and sorry about that echo. Yeah. So yeah, so that's it from our side. We'll be floating out a, feedback form. So basically, what we want to know is how do you like this meetup, and what could we change, and what kind of topics interest you, so that we can bring out those topics in the next set of events, or any other kind of things which you would like us to do online. Yeah. Okay, then that's it from my side. Brijesh?
So we'll look at the feedback, and if all are working very well, we'll do more online meetups. So even if you're outside Bangalore, We have a CFP form running. We'll highlight that in comment section, and also it's there pinned on our Twitter profile, BlrDroid. So please submit a talk if you want to. If it's a first time, we can help you. Just get in touch with Chitin, me, anyone from the organizing team, even BlrKotlin. They are our sister. Like they also run monthly, bi-monthly meetups. So please do follow, and we'll keep you posted for the latest content which we have. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll end this broadcast now. Thank you, everyone, and stay safe. Bye.